Welcome back, friends. In contrast to the last 2 or 3 videos that I've uploaded that have been a little bit more on the light-hearted side, at least in terms of me mocking people and, just having a jolly good time, this is the video I've been working on for several days now, and I think you'll understand why I was so keen to have a couple of fun things in between, because this one, friends, it doesn't make me happy to write it, it didn't make me happy to research it, it's not making me happy to record it, and I don't think it's going to make any of you happy to know it. So, oh boy, get ready. Let's real talk. To the chagrin of many conservatives and centrists even across the planet, the recent French election ended with the election of Emmanuel Macron. While given my support of Trump, I would certainly be a massive hypocritical twat to criticize Macron for his lack of practical political experience. I feel quite comfortable, however, criticizing Macron for his stances regarding immigration and the idea that French nationalism, and more specifically, that French culture, in his own words, does not exist. I mean, Jesus H. Christ. No such thing as French culture, Macron. Really? Okay, sure thing. I have evidence to the contrary, though. Well, I'll also refrain from saying anything about his mummified wife, since apparently doing so, even mentioning how old she is, makes you a homophobe somehow? Well, thank you, Emmanuel. Good to know she's the world's oldest trans woman.
Your pranks won't work on me, smooth skin.
My issue, and the issue that many who have supported Le Pen, regardless of any other opinions I may have towards her politics, is that Macron is a massive supporter of Angela Merkel's unrestrained open-door policy toward immigration from third world countries. Now, why is that a problem? I know my audience. Do you guys really need to have that question answered? Let's answer it anyway. Merkel, in her own words, has claimed that multiculturalism brought on by mass immigration is a failure. And as politicians across Europe, including most infamously Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, have essentially admitted that living in a multicultural society, the societies that they tout as being the pinnacle of civilization, in being in a multicultural society filled with first-generation immigrants and second-generation immigrants, primarily hailing from cultures that are fundamentally incompatible with Western values of equality, freedom, and justice, means that terrorism and ongoing violence are unavoidable byproducts of that multiculturalism. Yes, they have outright stated this, that living in a modern multicultural society, the societies they think are the best, means terrorism. All while they simultaneously tout the supposed benefits of living in such an enlightened society, where the rich can move away from the cities and ghettos where the migrants congregate and live, ensuring the policymakers and elite liberals who support this type of legislation will remain at a cozy and safe distance, while the lower and working classes, the natural citizens, are forced to cope with a massive increase in violence, rape, and crime in general. But Aiden, you filthy fucking Nazi. Any supposed rise in crime is clearly a class issue. It's an issue of poverty, not a cultural issue. That's why these same working class natural citizens were participating in the exact same levels of criminality before the inundation of immigrants and so-called refugees, who for some reason all seem to be young, able-bodied, working-age men rather than women and children supposedly fleeing an active war zone. Yeah. Sure, let's go with that. This is all just a class issue, right? And by the way, I'm usually the first to say that most differences are class issues, okay? Yeah, so we'll go with that. It's all a class thing. There is absolutely no cultural issue here whatsoever. Obviously, because this is a class issue and a class issue alone, whenever extreme violence occurs in these various communities, particularly those in the European Union that have adopted Merkel's limitless stance on immigration, as well as even across the Atlantic here in the United States, the race and the religion of the perpetrator need not be reported on. Because yes, it's a class issue, it's not a cultural issue. Don't report on race, don't report on ethnicity, don't report on country of origin, don't report on religion, because, as you know, this is all about class. It is not about culture. Except when the perpetrator is a white male. And then it is 100% about race. It is 100% about ethnicity. And it is 100% about a pervasive, vile, white culture.
Yeah.
Family.
Well, first of all, I just think it's very interesting that we're talking about racially profiling in the context of mass shootings. The vast majority of people who are doing the mass shootings in America are not Muslims at all. So exactly, the young white men. It turns out that even the people who are ideologically motivated, you mentioned ideology, you are 7 times more likely to be killed by a right-wing extremist, a racist or an anti-government nut job, 7 times more likely to be killed by that person than by a Muslim.
But is that ideology?
What I want to talk about today is that self-same hypocrisy of media reporting and the way in which crimes are framed in the legacy media, and that is this. There is only one group on the planet that can be identified anymore when a crime has been committed, and that group is this: white males. If you don't believe me at this point, I hope by the end of this video I've given you at least some pause for thought on the matter. I'm not a racist if people think I am.
We're not racist.
I'm actually just trying to look at this shit legitimately and earnestly. It is no wonder when I see the preponderance of evidence emphasizing the race of a criminal or terrorist only when their skin color is lily white, and moreover how the attribution and the locus of blame is so quick to go to sentiments of racism and discrimination only in those cases. We will cover over and over as I go through this video, as I go through my evidence, that when the perpetrator of a crime is not white, particularly now, with an increasingly desperate attempt by the legacy media and leftist politicians alike to seemingly play pretend that there is no tendency among Islamic culture to engage in violence in the name of their faith, that any crime committed by a non-white person is seemingly being almost instantly written off as being a result of mental illness or being the result of an extremely isolated person and an extremely isolated case, or both. Maybe you can just do both, as long as they're not white. But here's the reality of all this, friends. Terror, crime, and hate are never racial issues. They are ideological issues. There is no single race, be it white, black, Asian, etc. There is no single race that is inherently associated with criminality and crime. I'll make something of an extreme statement. If you believe that there is such an association, not only is your worldview going to end up being distorted, but hate itself becomes trivialized, ultimately resulting in the detriment of all human societies that prescribe themselves to this narrative that violence is racially based. Are you already starting to notice through some of the narratives I'm describing that the pieces of this puzzle don't quite fit together? Living in a modern society with many migrants means accepting terror as part of daily life, says Sadiq Khan. Living in a multicultural society of first-generation immigrants from a culture intrinsically at odds with traditional Western civilization values has nothing, though, to do with the increase in terrorist attacks. In fact, there has been no increase in acts of violence and terror. Well, those two ideas seem incongruous, don't they? Moreover, when a white male commits a crime, it is almost always a direct result of radical, racially motivated hatred and evidence for the necessary removal of a right to bear arms. Yet when a first or second generation migrant commits a crime, oh well, that's an isolated incident, not worthy of reporting on that migrant's race, religion, ethnicity, background, because crime is simply a class issue, not a race one. I agree, by the way. But again, do you see how these pieces don't quite seem to fit together and fit in the same mold? They don't, now do they? This is the politicization of terror that is being used to fuel liberal narratives of the evil of one group across the world, and that group, white people. Truly, were you to listen to these narratives without a careful analysis of how the rules apply differently for white men compared to everyone else, it does become a bit obvious why so many millennials truly think that all white people are evil, that there is something about their race that makes them bad. Despite the fact that that is, in fact, the definition of racism. But again, I guess if you follow that mindset, then you believe that you can't be racist against white people because of power differentials, I suppose? And yes, that's also essentially what they've been told by the effects of media through framing and linguistic spin. In this narrative that has been constructed by liberal politicians and the legacy media alike, the focus on race in the face of a horrible act of violence, destruction, and terror is the most repugnant thing one can do, unless, of course, the criminal is white, in which case race suddenly becomes the only thing that matters. Do you understand what I just said? It means that race doesn't matter until it's a white guy. Then it's the only thing that matters. And before you lump me in with one of those evil, terrible white bigots that, we should hate so much because after all, I am white, and as we just learned, only white people can be inherently evil, so odds are good I'm just another horrid racist white person, right? Before you lump me in with that. Alright, sure. Before you do that, before I don my white sheet as I do every day, let's take a look at a few examples on what I'm referring to when I talk about this hypocritical racial demonization. First things first, I need to point out that my claim that white people, and white males in particular, are being singled out for violent crimes due to their race is not something I'm making up. This CBC article by Neil MacDonald details various acts of domestic terrorism and violence across Canada, following the deadly mosque shooting in Quebec earlier this year, carried out by white shooter Bissonnette, who has been subsequently categorized as a Trump supporter because he liked some conservative groups on Facebook, despite the fact that he also liked several liberal groups, but hey, he's white. So obviously he's a horrible racist Trump supporter, and this act of terrible violence, because it is an act of terrible violence, it was horrible what happened, can easily be attributed solely to that. In fact, Neil, while discussing several acts of violence carried out by whites over the last 40 years in Canada, seems to lament the very concept that any of these crimes would be labeled as the act of, quote, bad apples. Instead, he suggests that it is indicative of a cancerous vein of intrinsic white racism, revealing the core of the vile nature of the white man and his incessant racist bloodlust, as it is broached as a topic of discourse. Speaking of which, this very conversation usually cannot last more than a few words without bringing up the infamous Dylan Roof, who in 2015 shot and killed 9 people in an historically black church in South Carolina. Like the Quebec shooting, it is a terrible, hideous loss of life. And also like the Quebec shooting, a disgusting act that is directly a response and byproduct of white racism. Was Dylan Roof a racist and a white ethno-nationalist? Yes, he was. Which is why, in what I personally find to be some of the most disgusting hypocrisy I've ever seen in the media, they saw Dylan Roof as a gold mine to exploit till the vein runs dry as irrefutable evidence that when white people commit acts of terror or violence, they always deep down are doing it as an act of racism and not just pure insanity. No, they are racially motivated because, once again, as we obviously know, as is self-evident, all white people are racists. The thing is, though, Dylan Roof was also fucking insane. Truthfully, do you want my real read on terror? I think a massive extreme level of mental instability is a fucking prerequisite for terror. I would call with very few exceptions. Most people who engage in acts of mass violence inherently psychologically disturbed. Yet again, it appears that the only time a motive can be instantly attributed to racism or race, in addition to that baseline of insanity, is when the perpetrator is white. Listen, I'm not a white nationalist. I understand white nationalism quite well. I have many friends who are white nationalists, and all of them despised Dylan Roof for his egregious and repulsive and repugnant murder of innocent, mostly older Christian black women. You can hate white nationalists all you like. I don't believe in hating anyone based on an ideology indiscriminately. Well, certainly I think caution is a logical response to some ideologies, but I don't believe in inherent hate of someone for something they espouse. But Dylan Roof, his horrific crime, is now going to be for forever used as a beacon of how whites are so ready to become racially hateful and murderous. Yet, when violence is committed by a non-white person of a different race, a different culture, a different religion, I think the mainstream media and I can agree they won't agree on the white person thing, but for everyone else, that the very first thing that you need to engage in these kinds of horrible acts of violence and terror is being insane first and foremost. People may be radicalized on top of that. They may be radicalized, these people, on top of that insanity. But as far as I'm concerned, you have to be, a little bit of a psycho first to be a psycho killer. So again, why is it only when white people are involved where an insanity plea is frequently discounted? Let's take a look at this Washington Post article about Dylan Roof and domestic terror, where the author makes the exact opposite claims that I am currently making, which is why I think it's important that we look at this. This is the inoculation effect. See guys, I'll always tell you when I'm using some social psychology on you. I have to inoculate you with the opposite argument, but also because it's important that we do do hear both sides of the story. This author for the Washington Post, Anthea Butler, is incensed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation claimed that Dylann Roof had mental issues because, in her opinion, it somehow erased the horrific nature of the crime, positing that his actions could not be attributed to anything beyond racially motivated hatred. Yes, sure. Someone who goes and fucking murders innocents for any ideologically driven motive is without question just a totally sane bloke, eh? She in fact states that the media does the exact reverse of what I've suggested, in that it's only labeled terrorism when a non-white person does it. Then why is it that the race of a criminal is usually only reported on immediately when that criminal is white? We'll get there, Anthea, but don't worry. My point in bringing up this article is again because this is the typical narrative you're going to see in the mainstream media. That truly, white people are the ones who commit all crime, or almost all crime, and that violence that they commit is somehow a virtue of their race and should not describe them as mentally unstable. We should not do that. It's their race. It is not a mental issue. Sean King, yes, our old friend Talcum X, suggested that to stop crime and domestic terrorism, all we need to do is ban white people. Well, I certainly hope he bans himself from this fucking planet, but okay, Sean, let's just take your little argument, right? He backs the statement up by doing the same kind of thing as Anthea, by positing that violent crimes in the United States, particularly mass shootings, are always carried out entirely by white men, listing the top 30 mass shootings with the highest death tolls. I hate saying top 30 mass shootings, that makes it sound like some kind of pop music thing. Interestingly enough though, although he does admit that one crime on the list was committed by a non-white person, he somehow conveniently forgets to note that the most deadly mass shooting was the Pulse nightclub shooting, which was at this point, I think we can definitively say, motivated by the shooter's Islamic faith. But yeah, sorry, that's an inconvenient fact to Sean, so he just glosses over it. See what I'm saying to this point, friends? There is a definitive perception among people and outlets in the media that white people are the problem because they tend towards racist radicalization, and that's why they're the only ones who commit acts of domestic terrorism and engage in school shootings. Except that's fucking wrong. Here is a list of mass shootings committed by non-white males since 1979. Now, I'm sure Sean would claim certain perpetrators on this list, like Elliot Rodger, are white, while applying his tanning lotion and carefully styling his facial hair and speaking in a totally legitimate and not excessively racist and insulting adopted speech pattern to attempt to mirror inner-city African-American vernacular English, but the list stands that not all mass shootings and not all school shootings are committed by white people. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer to me, but apparently it needs to be said. That's a fact, Sean. And that means that the narrative that all whites are evil and racist is inherently flawed. But alas, these are not approved of facts, which means we must ignore them, correct? Instead, what do people like Sean King and his contemporaries suggest as a way to stop the vile white man from constantly engaging in acts of racially motivated violence? Well, of course, it is to remove the right to bear arms. Because again, whites are the only ones who use guns, and if we don't have guns, domestic terrorism and school shootings will obviously just vanish into the ether. Yeah, okay. This video is going to take a fucking while to get to all of these individual sub-points. Because of that, here's a fun game you can play with yourself beyond masturbating. You can make yourself a little personal scorecard to ensure that I address every single point I have laid out as breadcrumbs in this initial groundwork I've just laid for you. The groundwork I was just laying there, and guys, this is gonna be a real doozy of a video, though. The groundwork I was laying was to specifically illustrate that there is a dominant and pervasive narrative in the West that white men are uniquely violent, and that their violence is typically, if not always, racially driven. So with that established, let's turn our eyes away from the United States, from which the lion's share of this framework originates from, and turn our eyes instead to Europe. And since we started this video discussing Macron, let's also start this further analysis of the hypocrisy of white males as inherently evil and racist in contrast to the perpetrators of terrorist attacks in the nation, which of course never have anything to do with a belief system or an ideology. Yeah, let's start by looking at Charlie Hebdo. In January of 2015, two brothers murdered 12 employees of the satirical magazine in Paris. despite shouting Allahu Akbar and that they had avenged Muhammad as they viciously massacred people within the building. Many subsequent news outlets have painted these two brothers as natural-born French citizens whose actions were a result of their class and poverty, and certainly not associated with Islam in any way. They were just confused and disturbed young men. Very different already than someone like Dylan Roof, you see. Roof is inherently evil. He's not mentally ill, no. And he is certainly not a product of a warped system that made him feel disenfranchised like the Kawauchi brothers, right? No, he is a product of a racist system. Not because he had some struggles. No, it's just white racism. I mean, certainly, there are, without a doubt, cases where Islam is tied to terrorist action in the media. At least temporarily, such as was the case with Yassine Salhi, also in France, who murdered his boss later in 2015. Strangely enough, however, despite the fact that the police knew Salhi potentially had ties to Islamic extremist groups up to 10 years prior to this murder, he was under no current investigation at the time of the incident. And honestly, I have real qualms and real questions that had Salhi not killed himself in prison before his case garnered more international attention, that much like the Kawauchi brothers, probably there was going to be some personal problem that forced him into such a behavior. That would be the media narrative, I'm sure. Certainly something unrelated to radicalized Islamic terrorist organizations that he had expressed affiliation with multiple times. No, he was stressed and his life was just so difficult he couldn't help it. But let's move on, shall we? Yes, let's move on to the terrorist attack in Nice the next year, wherein Mohamed Bouleh drew a truck through the Bastille Day celebrations, killing 86 people in an act of almost incomprehensible violence that was actively claimed by the Islamic State. Yet, once again, much like as was the case with the Kawauchi brothers, as time went on, question of Muhammad's affiliation with Islamic terror and ideologically driven motives for his heinous crime were raised. He wasn't a good Muslim. In fact, he smoked, and he drank, and he didn't attend mosque. Yeah, like, when your faith says that your sins are absolved by martyrdom, there's no reason that the unfaithful would be the most ideologically motivated to become martyrs or anything. Forget that, let's move on. Many of the people he killed were Muslim, obviously. There is nothing about Islam that would have caused him to do this. Again, guys, are you seeing the difference in the way these kinds of cases are handled? All of these attacks, regardless of who takes responsibility for them, even if it's the goddamn Islamic State, regardless of what the perpetrators call themselves and claim personally as their own motivations, well, these are all incredibly and extremely complex tapestries of issues of class and poverty, not religion, not ideology. Am I painting you a picture here yet, folks? But while France has certainly been in the spotlight of this video because of Macron being all on board with Merkel to ensure many more migrants from the same regions as these previous criminals I've just described with the same shared ideology will be welcomed into the nation with open arms, France is far from the only nation facing these issues. In December of 2016, another deadly vehicular attack struck the Berlin Christmas market, killing 12 and injuring 50 more. Despite also being directly claimed by the Islamic State, you can easily see the narrative having been altered to indicate that the attacker, Anis Amri, was not someone radicalized by an ideology that encourages violence, but was rather a mentally unhinged drug addict. Again, there's no common thread here, is there, people? Just a lone bad apple. Yeah, we'll use that term. Until you come across someone like Bissonnette or Roof. Obviously, those two clearly were motivated by race and a shared doctrine of discrimination and hate. Yes, of course, the fact that Amri was under investigation up to 9 months prior to the attack for his ties to radical Islamic groups is just a meaningless coincidence. He was just a crazed cokehead, a lone wolf, not unlike Khalid Massoud, who ran over and killed 5 civilians in addition to stabbing a police officer. Oh, yeah, I got a fucking aside for that one for those of you actually with your scorecards out. Again, despite being under investigation actively for ties to radical Islamic groups, just about every news outlet chose to portray Massoud as an innocent Kent schoolboy, a kind and professional man, who no one could possibly have pictured as carrying out such an atrocity. Again, just a bad apple, a rarity, an enigma. There could be no possible beliefs held by Massoud that are in line with any of these other terrorists terrorist attacks, all just random acts of aimless violence. People, sometimes this happens. Finally, and most recently, of course, in Sweden, an Uzbek immigrant, Rakhmak Akilov, who had been denied asylum yet continued living in the Scandinavian nation, engaged in another vehicular homicide, ending in the deaths of 4 people, including an 11-year-old girl this past April. And for once, for fucking once, it seemed that the people of Europe finally turned to see that another person claiming affiliation with the Islamic State may have actually had ideologically motivated reasons for conducting this repulsive attack. But given the current state of Sweden, wherein the police cannot legally report on a criminal's race, ethnicity, or country of origin, the fact that we know anything right now about Akilov at all is astounding. And I say that because all of these acts of violence, out of all of them, this is the instance with some of the least amount of information regarding the suspected motivation behind it. Then again, we are only a month out at the time of this recording from this tragic event, and as such I would say, wait and watch. Don't be shocked if in 6 months' time, Mr. Akilov is being painted in every media outlet as an innocent, misguided, and impoverished individual who actually didn't do nothing, as well as his terrorist constituents across Europe. But hey, come and tell me in 6 months' time if I'm totally off base in that assessment. Come back to this video. We'll see. Are you starting to see a little bit of a trend here, friends? Motivation, goal, and intent behind an act of repugnant violence can only be automatically and instantaneously assessed when the criminal is white. At least that appears to be the case in Europe and also in the United States, as it applies to Muslims who commit crimes. Surely, you say, the same is not true of black people in the United States. After all, Black Lives Matter has taught us that black people are massively mistreated by the police. Black people and black people alone. No, there is no preponderance of police acts against white people. That doesn't exist. Yes, sure. As if there is no extreme abundance of individuals who score high in the dark triad trait of Machiavellianism among the police or anything. As a form of power expression. No. As I described earlier in some of those initial articles, black people are constantly demonized far more severely in cases of crime than whites, right? That's what Anthea said. At least in the United States. Yeah, we demonize them. I mean, you need look no further than the fact that a Muslim, Maniak Sakar, who engaged in a shooting at UCLA in 2016 was initially identified as a white man. Because that is, after all, the expectation in the United States. Knowing that the inability of white men to just avoid engaging in acts of mass violence, yes, he must have been white. Despite the fact that the shooting appeared to have no ideological or racial motivation, he was instantly described as a white man in the press. The expectation is that any mass shooter in the United States will always be a white guy, as I've explicated with evidence. Take another case the other day in San Diego, where a man immediately reported as white. White was in every headline. He's a white guy. Disgustingly opened fire at a pool party. Astoundingly, pretty much the only thing we know about this shooter is that he's white, and the majority of his victims were black. Now, immediately, there was an inundation of racially motivated claims behind his actions, despite the fact that one of his victims was white as well. Yet here you can see the clear narrative framing that his victims were all people of color. They said it. Victims were people of color. They said it directly. Again, do you see the strangeness in this reporting? How the race was the first thing to be released beyond the crime itself, only when the suspect is white, or even erroneously believed to be white. This trend has become so common that some have even begun to call it the Ann Coulter effect. But again, clearly, there is such a prejudice in the United States against black people that there are far worse types of media castigation against blacks. Obviously, it's not just whites. No, black people are the ones who are truly the victims here. Black people are always mistreated by the police, and they always get the shitty end of the stick. Again, it's not just like the police are shitty in general. Except, just recently now, you folks may remember when Steve Stevens, a black man, live streamed his repulsive murder of an innocent older gentleman. It took days, in some cases, for the media outlets, particularly CNN, to report Steve Stevens' race as African American while he was still actively on the loose. That seems odd, correct? Because it is odd. Further, if you look at the case of Stevens, you can find thousands of tweets and internet posts insisting that he was just an isolated crazy person with nothing of hatred or violence to be attributed to his race. Yet could you imagine if the races were reversed? If Steve was a white man indiscriminately murdering black people in Cleveland on live stream? Well, I'll let you make up your own opinion. Before the manhunt in Cleveland, I recalled a shooting in San Bernardino where I was awake and on the ball early enough to see people actively on Twitter praying, hoping and praying that the shooter who took the life of a woman and a child was white. They wanted it. Interestingly enough, as soon as it was revealed that that tragic incident of domestic violence was perpetrated by a black man, all media attention paid to the event was dropped like a hot potato. Why, you may ask? Yeah, because the perpetrator was black, and it was his wife that he shot, and that did not maintain the narrative that only white people are terrorists and school shooters. Interestingly enough, just 2 years earlier, there was an actual ideologically driven terrorist attack in San Bernardino, which in 2015 resulted in the deaths of 14 people at the hands of an Islamic terrorist couple in a rare occasion where the media was actually willing to admit Islamic ideological radicalization was the culprit. Even more recently, at UT Austin, another black man who stabbed 3 people less than a week after an extremely racy, to say the least, post was made by Campus Antifa, calling for the death and murder of Greek institutions and sororities and fraternities. Yet, his race was not reported on until sometime after the fact, and now he is being described as a mentally disturbed individual with no racially motivated reasons for conducting this disgusting act of violence, despite the fact that he had uploaded videos to YouTube reenacting and apparently celebrating the Haitian genocide of whites. Again, can you imagine if the roles were reversed? I'll leave it up to your imagination. This video is not designed to change anyone's opinion. None of my videos are. In fact, I embrace discussion and disagreement. As I believe I try to do with all of my content, while I may be obvious in my standpoint, I think as an intelligent human being, you should look at what I say, analyze it, and come to your own conclusions, as we all should do as logical empiricists. But I do think I've made a decent case for the concept that there is one rule in the media and the public opinion for whites and another rule for non-whites, and how these cases of all equally repugnant violence are handled. I've said many times that I'm a pacifist, perhaps even to an extreme fault. As such, it is no surprise that any act of violence like those I have just discussed in this video make me nigh physically ill. And hey, you can call me a pussy bitch for that, I really don't care. But what I think I have illustrated here is that there is evidence that the only people who can be readily blamed for these awful crimes by nature of something inherent to their genetics, to themselves, to their race, that's a concept that is limited to white people. Before I end this video, there's one last thing I want to mention, and that is the issue of the right to bear arms. Again, if you're keeping score, hitting that note, almost every time a white person does commit an act of violence, and occasionally when a non-white person commits a similar atrocity, such as with Steve Stevens, the media is quick to blame access to firearms as the locus of their vitriol. But here's the thing, friends. Let's go back to the plethora of horrible events I have described in this video, and look at just how many firearms were involved. Of course, Dylan Roof, Bissonnette, the pool party shooter, all white men, but you also have Steve Stevens, both of the incidences at San Bernardino, as well as the case of Corey Al-Mohammed, a self-proclaimed black Jesus who shot and killed 3 people in Fresno last month while shouting Allahu Akbar. Obviously, access to firearms is the cause of all of these tragedies. Except remember, all of those terrorist, or I suppose if you want to take the media narrative, totally random and inexplicable events in Europe, all the times that vehicles were used, knives, well, there's this strict firearm legislation in countries like Sweden, where the horrific vehicular assault in Stockholm occurred so recently. In contrast, in Winchester, and throughout all of the United Kingdom, which strictly bans guns and the possession of firearms, did that yet stop Khalid Massoud from driving into innocent civilians and stabbing a police officer? Of course it didn't. Just a stringent firearm regulation has nothing to do to curb these violent attacks across the nations of the European Union. And now, in the now infamous case that has spread across YouTube like wildfire, where that same self-stringency of firearm regulation in the United Kingdom upset both sides, the left and right, with the Daily Mail choosing to lambast a YouTuber for merely illustrating how cheap aluminum stab-proof vests are actually quite stabbable. Yet rather than address the underlying issue of ideologically motivated violence, or the fact that that video was intended as a shitty knockoff review of stab-proof vests, the Mail instead decided to frame this man as a fucking ISIS recruiter. Strange, isn't it? How both sides appear to be so completely insane on this issue. Yes, this is a problem. Yes, obviously the problem is not an ideology. It's the fact fact that you can go to YouTube and see a guy illustrating the low quality of a product. Oh yeah, of course that makes sense. Here's the thing. Regulating guns is obviously not going to stop this violence, because this violence is happening in Europe where there are very stringent laws. It happens anyway. The events I have mentioned that have occurred across the European Union and the United Kingdom should be more than sufficient evidence of that. The problem is not race. It's not even class. More than anything, what causes these cases of extreme violence and terror is this, a toxic ideology. And don't get me wrong, I'm not at all suggesting that there are no dangerous white supremacist ideologies. There certainly are, but they are in the minority compared to the prevalence of Islamic-motivated violent ideologies. Ideologies that support violence, not race, not gender, not anything that is inherent to the self. It's an ideology. There is no race of hatred. There is no race of terror. There are only ideologies. The media narratives that claim that only whites are racially somehow responsible for violence is not only absurd, it is without question irresponsible socially at best, and outright an attempt at racial division, segregation, and a call for outright violence at worst. The reason people like myself are so concerned with the mass immigration of Muslims from countries like Somalia and Afghanistan is because they all share an ideology that supports engagement in violent behavior in the name of that self-said ideology. It has nothing to do with the color of one's skin. It has nothing to do with someone's country of origin. Ideological radicalization and mental instability are ultimately the causes of violent terror. We need to be aware of this. It has nothing to do with race, one last time. Mental instability and ideology, not race. Sorry this was a little bit of a depressing video. I don't really have a fun thing to end on. Maybe I'll put a meme here. Hang on. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.